Hello and welcome to this tutorial where I'm going to look at slippery physics and how to make it so that your player hits an oil slick and goes a little bit out of control. This is an obstacle course game and I've got this oil slick here and I want to make it feel like it's slippery and it's hard to cut this corner. Now I've experimented with a few different ways of approaching the slippery physics problem and I've arrived at one that I'm quite happy with. Although this is really, for me, this is more about the game feel and gameplay. If you were more interested in like a simulation of what slippery physics would actually look and feel like and do, then this isn't really approaching it in that direction. But you can, there's so many solutions to this problem, you can probably go away and have a think about how you might want to implement that in your game. So in my game, what I want to do is I want to make it so that when I hit this oil slick, my velocity keeps pushing my player in the direction that they were traveling when they first hit the oil slick. And because there's a massive reduction in friction when you're on something slippery, that's the whole point of something slippery, is less friction. It's harder to change direction, it's harder to stop. And so we can use some of the forces and the physics that are already inbuilt in the API to continue to push our character in the direction they were traveling when they first hit the oil slick. And I think that's the most fun and interesting approach to an obstacle course game, having an oil slick. So there's our problem. How do we do that? And let's break it down. And if you want, you can follow along. If you've got your own ideas about how to approach this, then please feel free to do that. And post about it in the Discord, and let's share knowledge on how to approach the slippery physics problem in Crayta. Right, so to start with, this isn't actually the whole oil slick. I want to add a much larger one, and I've separated out where I'm going to do that because I want to do that on an on-collision event. So when a player hits the oil slick or contacts the oil slick at all, that's when we should experience this slippery momentum fury thing that's going to happen. So I'm going to create a new voxel mesh called oil spill. I'm going to add that new voxel mesh just to the top here of this oil slick. Let's color it in that fabulous oil voxel that we got as part of the battle pass, the Mechanical Revolution battle pass. And I'm just going to make it into a nice big square that's one voxel high. You can see that the renderer is having a bit of a hard time because there's voxels that are exactly the same position, so it's trying to like put one on top of the other all the time. But we can solve that problem in a really simple way. All we need to do is hit F1 to, if you're in advanced mode, hit F1 to open up the transform gizmo, the move gizmo, turn off grid snap, and then just very slightly move it either up or down. So I'm going to move mine down, and I really like it when here we've got the train track, and I like it where the oil is kind of spilled in between the train track wood planks, whatever they're called. There, I think that looks cool. And we've still got some vegetation there, which is quite fun. So this is my oil slick, and it's come from these oil barrels. So now that that's done, what I want to do is do something when a player collides with that voxel mesh. So let's just add a script to this oil spill here. I'm going to do, with this oil spill selected, I'm going to click Entity, Add Script, New Script. And this is going to be called my slippery script. And in here, I'm going to edit that script. And I'm going to create a function. So function, slippery script, colon, and this is going to be called trigger slippery. We create that new function there, and with open and close brackets and then end. And I'm going to call this function from a collision event when the player collides with the oil slick. So when that collision event occurs, between these brackets, I can actually capture whoever just came into contact with that oil slick. So whatever character just hit the oil slick will be passed to this function as an argument. And that means that essentially if we put player in here, that player is then stored within that variable there. So that's a reference to whoever just came into contact with the oil slick. And I'm just going to do player send to scripts, and I'm going to send an event to all of the scripts connected to the player. The event's going to be called hit slippery, on hit slippery. And that's it. So that's the slippery script, and let's just hook that up to the collision. So on the oil spill, you can see I've got this slippery script here. I'm going to click on the plus next to on collision, drag the oil spill into the entity like that. The script should pre-fill with a slippery script, and the event is trigger slippery. I can actually get rid of this init function as we're not going to need that. There we go, save. So Control S is save. I'm saving all the time so that it's updating down here as well. Okay, so that's the contact with the oil slick taken care of. Now, this is sending an event called onHitSlippery to our player, and we want to do something with that. So onHitSlippery is now a function that will be attempted to be called on every single script that's attached to our player, but there aren't any scripts with onHitSlippery as a function yet. So we're going to go and add that. So let's go to the player. Let's create a new script folder, create child script folder, new script folder. This is going to be called slippery player. And within slippery player, I'm going to add a new script called slippery player script. And so here we are. We've got the slippery player script there. I'm going to edit that, clicking this button here. And so this onHitSlippery will be called on every script attached to the player. The slippery player script is attached to the player. So I want to write a function that will listen out for that event. So let's do that. So function slippery player script colon, and I'm just going to copy this these words here and paste them here. I'm going to allow clipboard access because I'm on Stadia, and open close brackets and then end. So now our player is registering that they've come into contact with something that's slippery. So let's just test that this is all hooked up correctly and works by just launching our player in the air. Self, get entity, launch. And let's launch them vector.new. So we supply this launch function. We're going to, in between the brackets here, we're going to give it a vector, which is a direction and magnitude at the same time. So it's 3 numbers, X, Y, and Z. How much do you want to push them in each direction? Now I want to push the player 0 on the X, 0 on the Y, and Z is up. So I'll push them 1,000 units up, or 1,000 Newton meters a second up, or whatever the force is measured in. Yeah, so I'm gonna launch them at that force, and this should be called when they come into contact with the oil slick. So let's test that. So I pressed F5 to test, and now I'm going to run over to the oil slick. And when I come into contact with it, you can see that it's basically working like a trampoline now. And if you wanted to make a trampoline, that would be how you do it. Cool. Okay. So we know that this is all hooked up and working correctly. And this is a really good approach when you're trying to do something a little bit more complex, is to do it in stages, bit by bit, to make sure that each bit is working before continuing to the more complex section that comes up next. So we know that this works so far. Now, the way I'm going to approach the actual making it feel slippery is, rather than launching the player straight up in the air, I'm going to launch the player in the direction they were traveling and a little bit up in the air. The reason I'm launching them in the direction they're traveling is because I wanted to make it difficult for the player to stop and change direction. So if I keep pushing them in that direction with forces, it's going to be hard for them to turn and change direction. The reason I'm launching them ever so slightly in the air is because that means there's less friction because they're not on the ground. So if I just test this again and show you what I mean by that. When you're in the air, it's possible to move slightly. Now that's not necessarily how it works in the real world. In the real world, if you're fired into the air, then it's really difficult to change direction in the air because there's nothing to push off of. There's no friction. And so by pushing a player in the direction they're moving and in the air, it makes it a little bit more difficult for them to change direction, and it's constantly pushing them in the direction when they first hit the oil slick. So if that makes any sense, that's great. If it doesn't make any sense, don't worry, you'll see the effect of it in a minute when we complete the whole process. But that's the approach that I wanted to take in this game here. So with that said, let's change this launch vector and let's just launch the player in the direction that they're currently traveling. So rather than vector new that, we'll get hold of their speed at the moment. So local velocity equals self get entity get velocity. So that gets the speed the player's traveling. And I'm going to set the velocity Z to, let's say 200. And then I'm, rather than creating a new vector in between these brackets, that's this 0, 0, 1000, I'm just going to supply this velocity here. So the velocity is going to take the players whichever direction they're running when they first hit the oil slick and fire them continuously in that direction. And then whenever they touch the oil slick after that, it will fire them continuously in whatever direction they're moving in. So there you go. It feels a little bit more like a speed boost at the moment, which is quite interesting. But the important thing to note here is that it's actually quite hard to change direction. In fact, it's impossible to change direction. This might be due to the fact that it's quite pacey. It's quite fast, and we can figure that out. I don't think that players would accelerate when they hit an oil slick, so we might tone down the speed a little bit. And also when you hit the oil slick each time, if you are changing direction, then it will fire you in whatever direction you're moving in. So there's a couple of things we need to fix with that. So the first is how do we make the speed a little bit less full on and a little bit more uniform? So a good way to do that would be to normalize the velocity, which means essentially forgetting about speed and only caring about the direction of velocity. So we're going to do velocity equals velocity normalize. So this will now give us a vector between a vector with three numbers each between 0 and 1 rather than however fast we were actually moving. And then in here, in the launch, we'll do velocity times, let's say 500. And let's just see what that looks like. So we're expecting it to be a little bit more uniform and a little bit slower. There we go. So that's starting to feel like a little bit better. I think it's still a bit too fast. We could try 200. Let's go and test that out. Yeah, that feels a little bit more slippery, like can't quite control the player on that slippery oil. And this might be kind of what you needed, where you wanted to get to make it slippery. But there's a little bit more we can do here. If it was a big ice rink or a bigger oil slick where it was possible to change direction, this would possibly make it less easy to do that. I mean, we want to be able to change direction a little bit. So actually we should be applying this launch on tick when our speed drops below a certain amount so that we can still possibly change direction, but it's pushing us in the direction that it hit at the start. So let's create a new class level variable called self.slippery vector. And that's going to be this velocity times 200. So that's the direction we're going to continuously push our player whenever their speed drops below a certain amount. Slippery player script. Let's do an onTick function. So every frame, this function gets called here. And what we're going to do is check that the player's speed has dropped below a certain amount. So we can get the speed in any direction with length like that. And if it's less than 700, then that's at that point we will launch them. So only if it drops below 700 will we launch them. So it doesn't accelerate and continuously accelerate too fast. And the direction we'll launch them is this slippery vector. So let's try that out. Now it's probably erroring behind the scenes because there is no slippery vector at the start. And there we go. So now I can kind of move, I kind of can't. Let's just show that again. So now we're able to change direction ever so slightly. And it feels a little bit more slippery, but it doesn't stop when we leave the oil slick. So that's another problem. So what we'll do to stop that is having a flag that says, are we on the oil slick or not? And this will be self.slippery equals false. So we're not on it to start with. When we hit the oil slick, we'll set self.slippery to true. And then here in this if conditional here, we'll check whether we've hit an oil slick. And then the last thing we really need to do is determine when we are not hitting an oil slick. So to do that, we will add our slippery script to the terrain. Click on terrain, or click on the actual terrain, entity add script, slippery script. And then in our slippery script, let's create a function to stop the slippery. Stop slippery player. So work really similar to this one, where we're going to send an event to our script on hit non-slippery, and then we will capture that and essentially function slippery player script on hit non-slippery self.slippery equals false. So now we're checking here whether we're on something slippery or not. And we're only on something slippery if we've hit something slippery and we've called that function. If we hit anything else, so whenever we hit normal terrain, we will, it will turn slippery to false. And that could also be like a safe platform in the middle of an ice rink, or it could be that your character gets a power up that turns off slippery, or whatever it is. So now we can see that I didn't hook it up to the on collision event in the terrain. There we go. So on collision, drag the terrain onto there. And this is now stop slippery that we want the terrain to trigger. So when we're walking on the terrain all this time, when you first touch the terrain, it will be calling stop slippery, but it's already not slippery, so we don't have to worry about it. When we hit the oil slick, it turns on slippery, and then we hit the terrain again and turn off slippery. So it's hard to stop, but it is possible. And this is an area where it's a bit tricky. And actually I've hit a bug here because I can't touch the terrain because I'm stuck on this mesh and it's pushing me into the mesh all the time. So something like that, we can actually add a little trigger. So I've got a trigger here in this group of oil drums. There's a trigger here, and what I'm going to do is just on trigger enter, I'm going to, that's not right. Let's just delete that binding. So when the player hits this trigger, add a new binding. We need to add the slippery script. When the player hits the trigger on trigger enter, we should call the stop slippery on the trigger. So we're calling stop slippery when the player collides with the terrain, and we're calling stop slippery when the player enters that trigger. And so any like little areas like that where a player gets stuck, I can just put a little trigger in there and make sure that it stops the slippery in there. So it's slippery around the corner, and then as I'm going over here, it's constantly pushing me into this direction. And fortunately, I hit that trigger. So here we are. I've hit that trigger again, and I can get out of there. And it's not game breaking. So there we go. There's like a basic idea. There's another bug there. There's like a basic idea of how to approach the slippery physics problem. It's not perfect, but it's one way of approaching the problem. Another way I thought about doing it was maybe spawning a platform that carries the player. And it worked really well. It just, it was a bit complicated and very prone to errors. And there's simpler ways as well. Like one of the ways we touched on earlier on was to, rather than applying this force whenever the player's speed drops below a certain amount, just apply it when they first hit that slippery substance. And you could even just apply it once so that maybe the character gets used to walking on oil and doesn't slip everywhere. Who knows? It's your game. If you get stuck with this or have any improvements to suggest, then please let me know in the Discord. Head over to the Ask Anything channel or the Lua Help channel if you need an extra pair of hands or a pair of eyes to look at your script. And I really look forward to seeing what you do with slippery physics in Crayta.